Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss of internet shitlords, and this video, it's kind of, I don't know, this is mostly a video where I'm talking about a pet peeve of mine, but it is also a video that talks about the most fundamental aspects of what is a role-playing game, okay? And it's based on a recommendation that I think was Pencil Boy. So anyway, somebody sent me a link to a discussion on a failed RPG forum called RPGNet that is now mostly about extreme leftist politics. Don't go there. Go to the RPGsite.com instead, which is the place where you can talk with free speech about all kinds of RPG stuff, especially if you're into the OSR and stuff like that. The RPGsite.com. There you go. It's my little advertisement for it. It's not a paid promotion, YouTube. No, it's my own site, that's all. Okay, so, anyways, in this thread, it was really funny because they were having these epic debates about how basically an RPG that has a mechanic that is just fail or succeed is not enough, okay? So it's like, if the roll is like, okay, your saving throw number is 15, so if you get 15 or higher, you save. If you get 14 or less, you fail. That's not acceptable to them, right? Oh, the armor class means you need to get a 16 or higher to hit. If you get 16 or higher, you hit it, okay? If not, you fail. No, that's not good enough. That is, to them, not good enough. Why? Because they don't understand how role-playing works, but they think that they do, right? And so, like, basically they were saying that at the bare minimum, you have to have at least 3 or 4 categories of success. Probably 4 is what they came to the conclusion of, right? And all of this is meant to advocate the story gaming ideas, which it's very obvious to me now that 2024 is the year where they're trying to bring back story gaming, right? Because story gaming was a thing from the early 2000s. Well, back then it was originally called The Forge, and it was called RPG Theory, which is really stupid. But I mean, it comes out of like critical theory and stuff like that. So anyway, because these were like pseudo academics who were doing it, guys that were either low grade academics or failed academics that were making these games that were based on like profound theories of how to craft an RPG that always started with the premise that D&D is horribly wrong. It's like the worst RPG, and so you need to make something totally different from that. And of course, that meant that all that they made was crap. And these guys had. Eventually, they ended up calling themselves Storygames a little later. And they had this idea that every game had to be crafted for like one of 3 purposes. And of those 3 purposes, only one of them was actually the good purpose, which is narrative gaming, right? So narrative gaming, they came to call story gaming. And story gaming means that you are actively trying to tell a story in the process of the game, right? That the game is not meant to emulate a real world. Like, they failed. The first thing they did, they threw out D&D, and therefore everything else in their theory was horribly, monumentally wrong, right? So they said, like, D&D is actually just an incoherent game, because it wants to partly be like a war game, which is what they call a game as system. Partly it wants to tell a narrative, and partly it wants to be something miscellaneous, which they called simulationism, right? Because the thing they didn't understand is that whole concept of theirs was wrong. RPG play is fundamentally about emulation and immersion. And so emulation is the experience of creating a living virtual world. These were the things that they, by the way, said were wrong. That those things were completely anathema. They were like, to the story gamers, that is the most horrible thing you could imagine, is to do immersion, right? Immersion actually is impossible, and emulation is evil, okay? Because emulation attempts to create the idea of a living world, and that's something that ends up ruining everybody's fun, right? Which is just exactly the wrong thing, right? Emulation is meant to create a living world, and you do this by creating a sense of a setting that is bigger than just the player characters, and therefore it's not telling a story. It's a real world. It's not a story world, it's a real world, okay? And then immersion is when your characters become real enough that you are no longer the active consciousness engaging and deciding what they do. And that's a very interesting moment. It's that moment where you don't have to think, and not only do you not have to think, but it seems as though ideas come to you that you would never have thought you would have imagined naturally, and it was not the process of any rational sequence of thought to reach there, right? You just realize out of the blue, okay, Rongar the Barbarian would probably, like, you don't even think would probably, Rongar the Barbarian would charge this fence, right, or something like that, and you don't know why you thought of that, because that wasn't what you would have thought of normally, and it wasn't a process that you reasoned out what it was. It's just like you knew, because suddenly Rongar the Barbarian is alive and is a part of your. It's like it's what you could call a servitor consciousness, right? It's a separate consciousness from yourself that has its own personality, okay, and that you could then tap into. Okay, this is what an RPG experience is supposed to be like. It's supposed to be where you get to a point where your player character takes a life of its own in a world that has become alive. It's become a real world because of the combination of having been set up correctly and been played correctly. And so that's what is a successful RPG experience, is to get to the point of immersion. And that usually takes about like 2 years of gameplay, it's something like that. 200 hours or so anyways of gameplay to get there with the character, and to get there with the setting, for where the setting is emulative in a true sense. It takes about 200 hours of gameplay. So the Storygamers, though, were totally against that. They wanted to turn RPGs into a game of narrative crafting, right? Where not to be mistaken with story-based gaming, which was like the White Wolf games from the 90s and stuff, where the idea was the DM is a storyteller and he tells you the story, and you player characters had better go along with it or else. because it's always the DM has this story to tell, and that means the player characters aren't supposed to be the protagonists, really. They're only supposed to be the protagonists in the moments he lets them be. Because if they try to do anything that goes against his story, he has to make it impossible for them to succeed at that. And that's where you get to stuff that was called like illusionism, where you are given the illusion of choice. You can go down path A or path B, but it actually doesn't matter which of the two paths you go to. You're going to end up in the narrative experience that the storyteller GM wants you to be at, right? So that's storytelling. And then there's story gaming, which is actually where the DM has almost no power at all. He's just like a monopoly banker. But the players, through a series of very highly structured moves, usually, get to direct the story by this gameplay that has nothing to do with them going into character. They're playing as the players. The character's just like a piece on the board, and they are creating a story by these narrative events that take place. And this is where these mechanics of multiple options of success or failure come out of, for the most part. It's the most, because when they're talking about that on this story thread, or this RPG thread, on that failed site, what they're talking about is the mechanics of yes, no, yes, and no, but, or yeah, that's right. So like what those mean, those come right out of improv acting, which is basically story gaming, right? Improv actors are not playing a role. They're not immersing themselves in a character. What they're doing is using a series of mechanics that they all know, with like cues that they know, to create little vignettes in the improv, right? And yes, and no, but are two very important parts of that, because their idea is that in the telling of this improv story, to keep the skit going, you can't just have a dead end. It can't be like, yes, you succeed, or no, you fail, right? That if you get to there, then the skit has to end, right? So instead, what they have is yes, and no, but, which is where, yes, okay, you get the thing that you want, and then this other thing happens, right? Which brings you into the next process in the skit. Or no, but, right? Okay, the guy falls on his face, he fails, but then something happens, right? And that's what they want to make RPGs into, right? And you've seen, in fact, I'm pretty sure that the Daggerheart has a kind of yes and no but mechanic to it, and I know that MCDM, or whatever it's called, that terrible new game that other guy Matt Colville has done, that one has another even worse mechanic, which is also from out of story gaming, and they're all coming back. Like story gaming was dead by around 2014, okay, but now they're trying to revive it. All these people who were story gamers later jumped onto the OSR bandwagon and jumped into 5e. They took over, a group of them took over 5e, and they're the woke 5e crowd now, right? And then there's a bunch of them that are in Critical Role, and there's a bunch of them in the OSR. They're all trying to, like, they were all kind of laying low. They were like, yeah, first they had to get into power, and then they had to make money off of the products that actually make money, because story games don't, right? OSR does, D&D does, you know? So they needed to go where the money was, but they really hate that thing. They hate D&D and everything to do with it. So instead, what they wanted to do was to eventually get to the point where they're going to infuse story game mechanics. And I think they've realized that they've reached that point now, because this is the moment for them to run everything into the ground. And it must be stopped. And I'm here to stop it, okay? So that MCDM game, for example, it has a different mechanic, which is like, you succeed, but you succeed and you succeed and, right? So it's a mechanic where the player character is so protagonistic that it is impossible for him to ever completely fail, right? So he can succeed less than he wanted to succeed, or he can succeed the normal way he wanted to succeed, or he can succeed and do even more cool stuff than he expected to do. But there's no way for him to fail in that game. And there are several story games that are like that. And a few OSR games and things like that, the fake OSR games, I guess, that have borrowed from story game mechanics, you know. So this is all a product of these people having this conception of RPGs as being a thing to tell a story. If you believe that it's a thing to tell a story, then those mechanics in a way are fine, because it means that you're using the game to try to craft a little tale, and that's, you know, it's still gonna be less effective. Like this, the funny thing about this is that to try to tell a tale, the best way to do that is just to tell a tale. Right? As soon as you start adding mechanics to it, that makes it the same but harder, right? It's like it's the same thing as telling a story but with extra steps, dumbass. You know, like, what are you thinking? This doesn't achieve anything, right? Like, you're better off just improving it completely than making up any kind of a rigid structure, because the structure's always going to get in the way of the potential of making a good story, right? There's no structure that won't block that, because if the necessity of the story gets blocked by some kind of a mechanical restraint that, oh, you have to roll, that having to roll, it means it's going to not necessarily be the most optimal version of the story. It's stupid, right? That doesn't make sense. You know where mechanics of success and failure make sense? In a living world, because in a living world, you don't always get the best story. In a living world, you don't always get what you want. In a living world, there are moments where the protagonist, well, the guy that looks like a protagonist from a story, just gets hit by a crossbow bolt by some 14-year-old kid and then dies 3 days later in agony from an infection. You know? I'm never gonna... that's my bro, Richard Lionheart. We're still pouring one out for you, Richard. Okay, that's how he died, right? The greatest warrior in Christendom, right? That's how he dies. He gets shot at by a kid and then dies in a bed, you know? Like, it's sad. But that's real life. That's how people die in real life, right? That's one of the things that made Game of Thrones kind of interesting, right? Is that in most fantasy fiction had become so generic and it had become so formulaic that you always knew what to expect. And then Game of Thrones, instead, because it borrows from history, because it borrows from the War of the Roses, has a bunch of really unexpected shit happen in it where, like, people look like major protagonists die. But that's because, in a way, he's like telling a story. It is a novel, right? But in his case, but it's actually like a history novel, right? So there's unexpected stuff from the literary point of view. If all you've ever read is genre literature, you're surprised when people die out of nowhere, right? When Pedro Pascal's guy gets just dead in an instant, you're like, holy crap, right? But in the real life, that happened all the time, right? Like, I know, the Earl of Warwick's brother dies in an instant, right? This is stuff that happened in the War of the Roses, which is what Game of Thrones is based on. And if you really want to play it, check out Dark Albion, because Dark Albion is also based on the War of the Roses. So there, it makes sense to have success-failure mechanics. because the world isn't a story that is being told. The world is a real place where real things are happening, and it doesn't always go like in the fairy tales. The story happens, if anywhere, after the fact, after the game is over. Right, you're going to have everybody has stories about their RPG games. Sometimes there's stories that no one else but them wants to hear, but there's still stories to them, right? And those stories are like people who have golf stories or people who have fishing stories. You don't go to golf or go to fishing to create a story. It's not a story making exercise. The stories happen after the fact because it's a living world, because you never know when there's going to be a story. The story isn't the whole thing. The whole thing is you're going there, you're fishing, you're having a good time in this environment of fishing, right? Or playing golf or whatever, or playing D&D. The stories are your war stories, right? They're the things that come out of the most intense moments or the most interesting moments of that experience. And that's the only way you make story from it. So if you understand what RPGs are supposed to be like and what they're not supposed to be like, you can see which mechanics are actually going to work right for the thing that RPGs are supposed to be and which ones will not. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have multiple options of success. For example, but that's to measure degrees of success. It should never be to introduce narrative elements that change the world randomly and therefore crush the idea of a living world, right? Because if that yes and is like yes and then a unicorn appears, if that unicorn wasn't already there, you're ruining the sense of a living world, right? And in favor of it being magical story time, right? That something just happens that comes out of nowhere and fixes the problem, right? Or makes things better. But if you're talking about grades of success, right? So what you can do obviously is you can have a marker where if you succeed, in a lot of my spells in Lion and Dragon, and very soon in Baptism of Fire, it is done. The book is beautiful. The cover, I think, is awesome. You guys are going to love it. But the degree, in Lion and Dragon and in Baptism of Fire, the magic system is such that in a lot of cases you roll and you have to beat a difficulty to succeed. But if you get higher than a certain amount, like higher than 20, you can have a more powerful effect but that's just like a measure of the level of power of what you're doing. I thought, whoa, I got really well on this healing, so now I've completely healed this person instead of only having healed a d6 plus 1, right? That's different, right? Those are just degrees of success. That's fine, but that's not what they're talking about. And that's not what a lot of recent games have been doing. Recent games have been introducing story game elements into play, and they must have forgotten that I'm still here. Because I stopped them once, I'm going to stop them again. That's everything for today. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button, hit like, share the video, and check out all my products. Check out Sword and Caravan. Check out Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road too, which is the biographies of all these incredible figures that are from the Silk Road. And it has their character attributes, it has plot devices, it has a timeline, all sorts of stuff that you can use in your Sword and Caravan campaign, or that you can easily adapt to any kind of a, Eastern fantasy campaign, you could say. I think you're going to like that book a lot. It also has the assassin class for Lion and Dragon or Sword and Caravan. And check out Dark Albion if you want to see the real original Game of Thrones. And check out all my other books. This Old School Companion 2, which has 26 sandbox-style adventures. There's no thing there where the DM is leading the players by the nose or it makes them just spectators to some tale. Social Encounters on the Silk Road, and all my other books. Check them all out, especially right now, the Pundit Files. The latest issue as of this moment is Magic of the Kunlun Mountains, which has 20 ritual spells that are all based on Tibetan magic. Some of which are really weird and wacky, and some of which are pretty scary, actually. Those Tibetans didn't screw around. And you can pick that up from the Red Room, only at the Red Room store. The link is in the description below. The link to all my books are in the description below. And at the Red Room store, the Pundit Files only cost $3.50. So be sure you check that out. And, of course, check out all the other Red Room products as well. As for Baptism of Fire, like I said, it's done. I've seen the whole book. It's a gorgeous book. It's going to be so all-inclusive, a complete game system and a complete setting. And you guys are going to love it. We're now going to have to submit it to Drive-through RPG for them to make a print proof. Once the print proof looks okay, that's when we go live. So it's still going to be probably another 2 or 3 weeks, but it's coming. All right. Currently smoking, Lawrence Eddy Egg, plus Argento Natural, about to begin.